Today's theme is social change, and probably when you think about social change, you're thinking about kind of contemporary issues, you're thinking about it through subjects like sociology. What I'm going to do is to take you on a journey that's going to involve different subject perspectives, so in particular using anthropology and archaeology to think about social change, but with a very sort of particular perspective. And this is trying to think about what happens when different cultures actually come into contact. And so, to begin with, when I'm talking about social, I'm presuming that the social kind of covers everything. We tend to think about the social perhaps to do with organisations or to do with sort of relations between people or groups of people. But actually, there are many other dimensions to the social. So most people would imagine that their world also extends to sort of gods, deities, spirits and so forth. We can also see that the social is something that's sort of wrapped up in the material world. We make material culture, sort of clothing, the objects that we use, the spaces that we use, and in turn those material things actually control and shape the way that we perform being social beings. You think about this lecture theatre, for example, its very physical form is actually reproducing a set of expected social relationships between you as students and audience and myself as lecturer. So I'm going to focus quite heavily on some of the material dimensions of social change. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at those situations where change comes about through the meeting of cultures in a way that could be seen as being asymmetric. So in other words, you have one culture or one group of people that may for various reasons be more powerful, maybe more sort of, I call it sort of technologically entangled here, so it might have more sort of developed, more elaborate forms of technology, more elaborate sort of material worlds. And so it's a case of sort of thinking about what happens when very different groups of people with very different outlooks and very different material conditions actually come together. And as I say, I'm going to do that by looking through the medium of archaeology and anthropology. I'm doing that because I'm an archaeologist who's interested in anthropology, so that kind of makes sense. Now, we're going to go on a journey that takes in different places and different times. But the idea is to show you that there are some common themes that can be drawn out of this process of culture contact. So, part of the lecture is going to focus on familiar ground, on basically southern England, so somewhere that you're all familiar with, somewhere you're all living in, but in the remote past. So we're going to be looking at the end of what we call the Neolithic, or the New Stone Age. So here, talking about 2500 BC or thereabouts. To put it in perspective, this is the time of Stonehenge. And then we're going to be looking at events that took place in Polynesia, which is basically the sort of Pacific Ocean region, made up of sort of scatterings of islands, individual islands and island groups. And in particular, we're going to be looking at one island, a place called Rapa Nui, or as it might be more familiar to most people, Easter Island. But we're going to be looking at a much more recent period, basically the last sort of 300 or 400 years. And certainly in the case of Polynesia, what we have is a situation where we can see and document how European exploration, particularly during the course of the 18th and 19th centuries, led to Europeans, particularly think of people like Captain Cook, but also voyagers that are coming out of places like Spain, out of North America, etc., etc. We're bringing what we call culturally European groups into contact with these Polynesian communities who had a very different heritage, a very different kind of worldview. But before we get on to that, I think it's worth sort of looking at some modern instances of the kind of consequences of this process of European exploration and engagement with the Pacific world. And we can look at some relatively modern and even some contemporary instances of how some of the local groups here in Melanesia rather than Polynesia have responded to the conditions that European exploration, engagement and colonialism especially has actually brought about. So when we talk about Melanesia, we're talking really about the big island groups just to the north and just to the east of Australia, a place like Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, New Caledonia, etc. And there's some weird and wonderful things that still happen within these islands. Particularly on islands like Vanuatu, there are a series of, if you like, sort of ritual or ceremonial performances that seem to mimic very closely the activities of Europeans and North Americans. So here we have people participating in what's known as the John From cult, which may be a derivation of John from somewhere. And as you can see, here we've got Vanuatans who are basically marching. They're holding big bamboo poles with what look like fake bayonets on them. If you could see their chests, some of them might even have USA written across their chests. They're basically mimicking the actions of soldiers. And here, they're mimicking the actions that they observed of American soldiers during the Second World War. And this is a form of activity that's known as cargo cult. And it's something that sort of sprang up, particularly in areas like Melanesia and Polynesia, during the 19th and the 20th centuries, as a result of people coming into contact with the kind of material power and material wealth of European and North American missionaries and colonisers and explorers and so forth. It's worth pointing out there's another cargo cult that happens on this island of Tanna in Vanuatu, and that's known as the Prince Philip movement, which basically worships Prince Philip. Now, at a very basic level, you could read this simply as Vanuatans, Melanesians who are kind of, you know, attracted to some of the things that they've seen being sort of brought into those islands, that sort of, you know, elevated the status of Europeans and Americans and want to just sort of be like them. But it's not actually that straightforward. So cargo cult is basically all about the sort of process of people wanting to acquire substances, wanting to acquire objects or goods which are seen to come from distant places. Now traditionally these societies, up until the point of European contact and exploration, you could call Neolithic, in that they were stone-using groups. They didn't use metal technology. They were subsistence farmers, fishers, and so forth. They were basically involved in a kind of subsistence lifestyle with a technological base around stone and organic materials like wood and so forth. Now, with European contact came materials like metal, and came all sorts of very interesting kind of goods and commodities. But also what came about with European contact was a series of destabilising events that basically challenged traditional authority, that led to varying levels of subjugation, even in some cases slavery, that led to colonial rule, that led to attempts to actually change their traditional religious practices, and so led to this sort of really quite sort of traumatic experience. And cargo cults are effectively responding to this kind of trauma. And what they're all about is acquiring these objects, or acquiring Prince Philip, not because these objects are seen to be desirable and powerful things that rest with these people from distant locations, but because they're perceived to be objects that these people actually own, or things that were generated and developed by their ancestors, and which at various points in time have actually been taken away. And so what this activity is all about is trying to attract back what is rightfully theirs. And you get all sorts of versions on this, including sort of indigenous takes on Christianity, that actually see, you know, Jesus as someone who was born in Fiji or born in Vanuatu, who then was taken away to these sort of strange and distant worlds of sort of Europe and Asia, and needs to be sort of brought back to their homeland. So cargo cults are about bringing back a lot of the material, a lot of the power, a lot of the sort of ancestral connection that's been perceived to be taken away from them. And it's done in various ways, particularly through mimicry, particularly through things like the formalised marching we find in the John Frum cult. In Highland New Guinea, groups following Australian contact in the 1950s, 60s, 70s would actually make artificial runways and even artificial planes out of local materials. This would never fly. I wouldn't recommend anyone ever try flying in that, by the way. But the idea is that these are things that bring in cargo, and these are objects which are designed as kind of attractors to bring back what is rightfully theirs. So superficially, it looks like people just want Western goods, but in depth, what it's all about is a process of regaining ancestral power, regaining what is perceived to be rightfully theirs. Well, we can now move on to a very sort of distant time, but look at something that spatially is very close at hand, and focus in on events at the end of the Neolithic, the end of the New Stone Age in southern Britain. And you'll all be familiar with Stonehenge. Hopefully it's difficult to escape Stonehenge in various ways. It's been branded, sold, shoved down our throats through television, through the media, in all sorts of ways. It's remarkably familiar, and of course it's always rolled out as being one of the great sort of mysteries of the past. In some ways its selling point is the fact that it is this wonderful mystery. The problem with archaeology is after a while it suddenly becomes less mysterious, in that you actually start to find out what it's all about. So apologies if I destroy the mystery of Stonehenge. Now, the thing about Stonehenge is that it doesn't exist in isolation. There are other great monuments, ceremonial monuments, that exist elsewhere within the wider region within which we find ourselves, particularly on the chalk geology of areas like Dorset and Wiltshire, going up from Dorchester in the south through places like Knowlton and Cranbourne Chase, up to Stonehenge, and eventually up to Avebury, not far from Swindon. And at each of these locations we find a series of monuments which are different in varying ways in their format, but are equally colossal. Now, Stonehenge is an incredible structure because of the process of moving the stones from great distances, particularly the blue stones which were taken all the way from West Wales and brought onto Salisbury Plain. The process of shaping and arranging those stones is also really quite remarkable, given that these are communities who are, as I say, basically sort of stone tool using groups. But we also find sites like Avebury. Who's been to Avebury? No one's been to Avebury. One person's been to Avebury. Okay, did you like it?
Yeah.
Would you recommend it?
Yeah, it's quite.
That's good. Okay, well there we go, we've got a recommendation, so you've all got to go to Avebury. The world's biggest stone circle, so large that it actually has got a village that's kind of built up inside it, enclosed within this massive bank and ditch. At places like Knowlton, we've got similar monuments, big circular banks and ditches and large mounds, all of these built for ceremonial purposes. So these are not places where people lived, these are places where people performed ceremonies, where they gathered to kind of communicate with ancestors and gods and so forth. Rather perversely, it's very difficult to find the traces of contemporary settlements, of where people lived. These were communities who were putting all their efforts, all their energies into building these colossal monuments that were about dealings with a kind of another world, an ancestral world, rather than the kind of realm of the living. Now, right throughout the Neolithic or the New Stone Age, we find monuments being built, but it's towards the middle of the 3rd millennium BC, around 2500 BC, that we see these truly great and colossal monuments being built, places like Avebury and Stonehenge, Knowlton and so forth. Sometimes these things reached a scale that is quite difficult to comprehend, and especially quite difficult to comprehend when it's very difficult to know why they were being created, what their purpose actually was. A nice example is provided by this huge mound that looks like a giant Christmas pudding, especially when it snows and gets snow on the top and it dribbles down the side. It just needs a sort of 4-metre piece of holly on the top to set it off. This is Silbury Hill near Avebury, up in North Wiltshire. It's the biggest prehistoric mound in Europe, 120 metres across, 40 metres high. You get a sense of its scale if you look at the road and you look at that car driving alongside. It really is a huge thing. Now, this belongs to this critical period. Here, its construction started about 2400 BC. It was constructed probably about a century or so after the main stone phase at Stonehenge. What's weird about it is the fact that it was a monument that developed in a series of stages. It starts off as a small mound, which is then enclosed, then becomes a bigger mound, an even bigger mound, etc., etc. It was constructed perhaps not with an idea at the beginning about what it might look like. Its kind of form developed as it was being created. It involved perhaps a million or so person hours to construct, or person days to construct. It would have required hundreds of people working in very difficult conditions, pouring out chalk, carrying it up to the top of the mound. And at certain points, as it was being progressively enlarged, it may not have been apparent to people when that process would ever stop. It must have seemed like it was labour that was ever going, that was never really going to come to any kind of fruition. Now, you'd imagine that making a big mound like this, it would have a very clear purpose. So you'd find underneath it a rich burial, or you might imagine it's being made to create a giant platform which looks over the surrounding landscape. But there is no burial, and its location in the bottom of a river valley means that it's not in a particularly conspicuous place. It may be that its purpose was just to mark the starting point, the springs that fed into the River Kennet, which then feeds into the River Thames, so it's marking an important location. But there are other easier ways of doing that. Whatever the case, it's clear that people were very driven, that they felt that building this mound was of critical importance, and they were willing to endure hardship on many different levels in order to create it. It really has something a little bit kind of crazy and millenarian about it, as though people are kind of wrapped up in occultic activity. Now, just building Silbury on its own, or just building Stonehenge on its own, or just building Avebury on its own would be enough. But when you look at the fact that all of these great monuments are being created more or less at the same time, you start to wonder what it is about that time, in the middle of the 3rd millennium BC, that made people do this. Why are they putting so much effort into building these structures which are essentially ritual or ceremonial in purpose? There are other things going on as well. What we find at places like Avebury and Stonehenge is that they start to join together earlier monuments as well as elaborating and building new monuments. And what they're doing is they're creating single kind of ceremonial landscapes, joining up monuments and rivers using earthwork or megalithic avenues. If you like, creating single complexes that were drawn together probably in set ceremonies. If you like, in giant sort of cult practices. And in the case of Stonehenge, we know that this is all about ancestor worship. This is all about basically sort of venerating the dead, and the dead who've been translated into powerful ancestors who are probably seen as holding power over the living. So there's something that's forcing people to engage in collective cult activity at this time. Now why would this happen? What I want to suggest is it's not coincidental that this is a point in time when there are very marked changes that are taking place in terms of the relationship of these communities within southern Britain with groups further afield. Now, the time around 2500 BC sees Britain going from being very insular, sort of culturally very different from the rest of Europe, to suddenly re-establishing contact with continental Europe, and in particular with groups that we sometimes refer to as being beaker people, because they use these distinctive kinds of pottery vessels. Now, these beaker groups, who we find right across Europe, had very different lifestyles, very different kind of material accoutrements, and very different ideologies and religious practices to the Neolithic communities of Britain. They were probably not people who necessarily imagined that ancestors were the kind of force that controlled and determined their lives. Critically though, they were communities who represent the earliest metal-using groups across most of Europe. They were involved in acquiring and manufacturing objects made of copper and of gold. You get sort of fancy gold hair ornaments, you get copper knives, you get copper axes and so forth. They also produced very distinctive, very colourful textiles, and they exploited and used a whole range of other materials, exotic stones and so forth, that meant that if you encountered one of these people, the thing that would probably stand out was bling, basically. They were very shiny. Now, from about 2500 BC, we have evidence that some of these beaker-using people were coming into southern Britain, perhaps to begin with, just as single individuals, basically people who are kind of exploring or travelling, but their presence set in train a series of very dramatic events. At one level, other people started to emulate them, started to sort of buy into these new ways of living, started to want to acquire things like beaker pottery, the metal objects, and the other elements that went with being part of this group. And we have one very early beaker individual from quite close to Stonehenge, someone called the Amesbury Archer, and you can see here within his grave some of the kind of material wealth that was buried with him. Whole series of pottery vessels, of fancy stone tools and metal objects which in some cases came from places like Spain or Portugal. And he himself, we know through isotope work on his bones, probably started his life in Central Europe, perhaps somewhere within the Rhine region. He was a traveller, but his presence and what he carried with him was enough to start destabilising an existing order. Now, it's quite likely that it's this sort of process of contact, in contact with people bringing in new technologies and new contacts and new ways of thinking about the world, that starts to destabilise traditional late Neolithic values. And so what happens is that people start building traditional monuments, but on a much greater scale than ever before. What they're trying to do is hang on to their traditional lifestyle by pouring in labour and resources and commitment into those traditional values. They're trying to hang on to them desperately. But in the end, what happens is that these new sets of conditions and contacts actually start to eat away, destabilise, and eventually lead to the collapse of those traditional Neolithic values. So building big monuments is a very desperate attempt to try and hang on to what is traditional in the face of change. Now, we can go to another part of the world where we also find big stone monuments, megalithic monuments, and quite often people might sort of think about Stonehenge and Easter Island in a very sort of similar fashion. Easter Island, of course, is famous for its stone statues, things that are called moai. And you can even see one of these in the British Museum. Unfortunately, it was the most important Easter Island statue on Easter Island, and it was nicked in the 1860s by the British. But that's kind of typical of our colonial history. So we have on Easter Island this sort of tradition of building big megalithic monuments, but in this case the megaliths, the stones, take a human form. And we know that these statues are basically images of important ancestors. A bit like the way that Stonehenge commemorates ancestors. Here, important chiefs, when they died, once they became ancestors, their form would be translated into stone. And in a lot of cases, they'd be set up on these ceremonial platforms. Anyone been to Easter Island? No, you've got to go. It is amazing. You'll have to put it on the list. The thing about it though is it's very remote, very, very remote. So here it is in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, you know, 5 hours from Tahiti by flight, 5 hours from Chile, one of the remotest locations in the world. But somehow Polynesian voyagers managed to find Easter Island around about 1000 AD. And not only did they find the island, but they then went back to where they came from. They collected together lots of people and lots of other resources and set off back to the island, hitting this tiny little speck in the middle of the Pacific, and settled it. And they did very well. They sort of turned up with sort of pigs and chickens and things, started to create sort of gardens. Eventually the population started to rise quite massively, so probably several thousand people living on this tiny island by sort of 1500, 1600 or thereabouts. And it's only about sort of 10 miles or so across at the most. However, by the time you reach the 19th century, there are only a few hundred Easter Islanders left. And people in recent years have tried to sort of come to terms with what was going on, why you should go from looking at a very successful culture that was obviously able to create some really spectacular monuments, particularly these moai, through to a situation where almost the entire island population was decimated. Now, there's a story that you're likely to encounter, and particularly through the work of people like Jared Diamond, that sort of sees Easter Island as a kind of a warning for the rest of the world. So this is what happens when people start to overexploit their environment. Now, there's no doubting that originally this was an island covered in palm trees, and you go there now and it's pretty much tree-free. And one argument, the Jared Diamond argument, is that what you have is a situation where people overexploited their resources, they cut down all their trees, they were then faced with overpopulation, starvation, they started killing each other, they started sort of pulling down these monuments, and basically all went completely pear-shaped. And it was the death of the old religion, etc., etc. Now, that kind of view in some ways is quite tidy from our perspective, because we were basically saying that the Polynesians were on Easter Island were responsible for their own demise. They didn't entirely die out. There were still plenty of Rapa Nuis on the island who can trace their ancestry back to these original Polynesian settlers. What we're now becoming aware of is the fact that rather than it being a case of ecocide, that the changes that we see on Rapa Nui have probably got more to do with the consequences of coming into contact with European explorers and then later whaling ships coming out of North America, and if you like, that process of interference from outside, which through things like the introduction of disease and slavery and so forth actually has a very sort of traumatic effect on the island. This is just a view of what it looks like. It looks a bit like some of the Scottish islands, but in 50 degrees heat. Okay. Now, Easter Island's a very unusual place, settled, as I say, about 1000 AD. It's quite likely that a few centuries after that, they were no longer able, because of the lack of large trees, to make big voyaging canoes. So certainly up to the point of European contact, they may have undergone several centuries living in complete isolation, not having any contact with any other island communities elsewhere in the Pacific. They really were kind of on their own in the middle of the world. And then in 1722 something really remarkable happened for the Easter Islanders, in that 3 Dutch ships, captained by Jacob Verwegen, turned up to the islands. This would have been the first contact that they would have had with outsiders for many centuries. Now, from their point of view, the world was a world that was inhabited by Polynesians, people like themselves. But what we have here are people turning up who, in many ways, are really rather different. They're speaking a different language, they're dressed in very different ways, and they're sailing in these amazing vessels, these really kind of elaborate and sophisticated vessels. The Dutch only stay for a day or so. They kind of accidentally kill quite a few people. They probably introduce some diseases and pathogens and leave them with large rolls of cloth and then bugger off. It then takes almost 50 years before the next Europeans turn up, the Spanish, and then followed in relatively short succession after that by people like Captain Cook and various explorers from France, Russia and so forth. But these episodes of contact, even though none of these European visits lasted more than a day or two at most, so each of these incidents probably represents no more than, say, 2 weeks' worth of contact, they had a very profound impact on the communities of Rapa Nui. The Europeans did very strange things. So, for example, when the Spanish turned up, their response to this island community was to try and implant Christianity there. So they basically marched to the highest hill on the island and set up 3 wooden crosses and conducted mass as a way of trying to Christianise the island. The locals sort of went along with this sort of this ceremony. They got very excited about it, but the locals, of course, were not seeing this as Christian, since the notion of something being Christian had no reference to them whatsoever. And instead, they went along crying Maka Maka, which basically is their prime deity. So what they saw was the arrival of the Spanish as marking perhaps the arrival of representatives of their supreme god. A European act which was designed to stamp European authority and Christianity on the islands, that from the point of view of the islanders was seen as a vague affirmation of their own worldview and beliefs. Now, when, first of all, the Dutch and then the Spanish turned up, they recorded the fact that all these statues, all these moai, were actually set up on these platforms. People were still worshipping these statues, these ancestral statues. But by the time of Captain Cook, very few of these moai were still standing upright. What's interesting is that in the intervening time, they tried to make the largest moai they'd ever constructed. So they were upscaling the size of these statues. But things were beginning to go wrong, and perhaps through a process of conflict, many of these moai were pulled down, and here you see the statues lying face down along one of these platforms, and their red hats or top knots lying scattered about. Something dramatic happened, and as these ancestral shrines were being torn apart, perhaps because of conflict between groups, perhaps sort of exacerbated by deaths caused by the disease introduced by Europeans, what we see is the emergence of new forms of cult, which basically take 2 traditionally important locations in the island and join them together. So certainly by the 19th century, there is a very active cult in operation, which combines the statue quarry, a place called Vanuatu. You can see all these statues just poking out of the bottom of the quarry, and you can see some of the bays where the statues have been quarried out. And it combines Vanuatu with a place called Orongo, which is on the edge of a huge extinct volcanic crater right at the very end of the island. And this cult activity was constructed around something called the Birdman. And this was an annual performance which was designed to elect a leader for the year. So local chiefs would gather at Orongo. They would delegate their best warriors to then swim to an isolated island off the end of Orongo, having clambered down a really, really steep cliff, swum across the shark-infested waters to try and pick up the first egg of the sooty tern, which is an annually migrating bird. And then the first person to bring back that egg, his chief would then be elected as paramount ruler for the year. Now that person would be deemed so important and so powerful that they actually became untouchable. So what they would then have to do is spend the entire year living in a house at Ranarawaku, having food brought to them and having no other contact with human beings. It's a bit odd, isn't it? But it kind of worked for a while. But what we're seeing is, out of a kind of traditional ancestral form of veneration, the emergence of new cults, which are pulling together different places within the Easter Island landscape. And this is almost certainly in response to the process of contact with Europeans. One of the things that we find at Orongo, for instance, within the series of stone houses that we used as part of the annual ceremony, are lots of paintings. Paintings both of the birdman, the sort of half-human, half-sooty tern figure, and traditionally it was these sooty terns that were seen as the vehicles for transporting the souls of the dead off to an ancestral homeland, Hawaii. What we also find though are paintings of ships. Some of these could be very stylised representations of traditional forms of Polynesian canoe, but other of these paintings are combinations of the form of canoes with the form of European vessels, especially these arrangements with three masts. So they're seeing European ships as being special forms of canoe, and they're equating them with the notion of the travel of the soul off to this ancestral homeland. So these European ships are seen as being very powerful kind of conduits to actually take them back to the place where they originated. Now, out of that developed a very sort of explicit form of cargo cult during the 19th century. At various locations across Rapa Nui, there are funny lumps and bumps in the ground, and if you look at them closely, they're actually in the shape of ships. They're basically sort of ship shape. You can see lumps and bumps where they may originally have been sort of deeper pits that were a bit like the kind of holes of ships. And we know from some very late historical records made in the early 20th century that these were the locations where special performances would take place. These were modelled on European ships using the same dimensions. We know from one that's been excavated that within the holes they even set in ballast, just like you'd find inside a ship. They'd have a wooden superstructure on top. And every once in a while people would congregate and they would act out, or they would play out being on a ship. So someone would be delegated to be the captain, and he'd spend all his time marching about swearing at everybody else. There's also sort of instances where by this stage they're encountering steamships, and they make a lot of effort to try and replicate the smoke and the steam of these vessels. So what's happening here is that people are mimicking these European vessels. But again, within the context of cargo cult, what we have to understand is that they're not pretending to be Europeans. What they're doing is they're acting out a way of trying to connect back to their ancestors and trying to connect back to what they see as being the kind of power and resources that may have been taken away from them by European explorers and visitors. So a series of different scenarios in different times, but in many ways there are common themes that we can see. First of all is the fact that things change as a result of people coming into contact with other cultures. There's no doubt about it. People are very adaptable. People are very good at sort of assimilating and taking on board opportunities that might be presented. We're all very good, for example, when you think about our culinary practices of picking and mixing different sort of culinary traditions from across the world, of adopting other traditions that aren't even our own. Think about how, you know, the American sort of tradition of Halloween has suddenly become a very big thing within the UK. But what we tend to find is that these situations of cultural contact don't necessarily lead to the kind of superimposition or replacement of one set of cultural values over another. The kind of local views, local worldviews are still present. People are just acting out those views, those ways of understanding the world through different material conditions and opportunities. And what we can see here is that although at first sight what happens in the late Neolithic in southern Britain may, you'd imagine, be very different from what's going on in Polynesia or Melanesia during the 18th, 19th and 20th centuries, there are strikingly similar resonances. And this reflects how people are trying to accommodate coming into contact with other groups of people who are perceived to hold more power or control over power than themselves. And I'll stop at that point. Just one quick thing to say, I'll shamelessly advertise our new archaeology and anthropology degree.